I want to start out tonight by asking a couple of questions. And they're going to be questions about terms that if you've been here for any length of time, you've heard them a lot. And when I ask you these questions, I don't really want you to raise your hands. It's not for everybody else to see. This is just for you, just for our own learning purposes. But how many of you are involved in serving? Okay? Everybody got that? And how many of you are involved in community? Right? We talk about these things all the time. So, and the next question that I want you to think about right now is, what's the difference between the two? What's the difference between serving and what's the difference between community? If you had to define that, practically speaking, in your life, how would you define that? You know, I've been going through this thing here recently with Stephen and Woody, where we're trying it amongst ourselves first, but we sit down and we talk about the areas in our lives that we see strengths that we have or gifts. But at the same time, we also have the freedom to look at each other and say, if I could change one thing about you, this is what it would be. If you guys want to try something interesting with your friends, try that sometime. But when they looked at me and they said, well, if we could change one thing about you, what it would be is that you have a tendency to see everything in black and white. And I totally agree with them, mostly just because Woody's sitting here right now. But I totally agree with them. I do have a tendency to see things in black and white. Things either are or they aren't for me. If I do encounter a gray area, my typical mental approach to that is I just haven't thought about it long enough to figure out if it's black or white yet, because gray just is not an option. But what it also does for me is it causes me to take things in my life, relationships, people, areas, and put them into boxes. I like to put everything into comfortable boxes. And what God's really been working on with me this week is this idea of serving and community, and the fact that I have them both in very separate boxes. And I don't think that's what He has intended for us. But before we get into that, I think we need to really define what I mean by serving in community. So the first thing I would say is serving. Woody gave us a definition of this on Sunday. He said, serving is done with others for God. Get that right, Woody? Serving is done with others for God. So for me, when I first became a Christ follower, that meant serving on the parking team, right? Serving with others for God, help people find parking spots, pray for them as they're coming on the lot. It was awesome. The other thing we're talking about tonight is community. Now, the way that I would define community would be meeting with one or more people for the sole purpose of moving closer to God. Now, guys, this does not mean getting it together with your friends to watch football and talk about everything but God. So when I talk about community tonight, once again, I want to stress, I'm talking about getting together with one or more guys for the sole purpose of moving closer to God. But what God, like I said, has been showing me this week is, Will, you have this tendency to want to put serving and community in these separate boxes. And to be honest with you, I don't think for me, I don't think for you guys, I don't think for the body as a whole, I don't think that's the way He intended things to be. You know, in the same way that I don't think that we can take God and put Him in certain areas of our lives, let Him have access to certain areas of our lives. You guys remember we talked about Backpack Jesus? The way that we can't put God into boxes and only give Him access to certain parts of our lives. In the same way, and the reason is for that is because God wants to be intertwined in all areas of our lives, intertwined in such a way that it spills over into all areas of our lives, right? I think He wants the same thing with serving and community. That is, He wants serving and community to be intertwined in such a way that it spills over into all areas of our lives. So the first question is, so what? Does this really matter? I mean, for a lot of us right now, we say, I've got this place where I go a couple nights a week where I serve. And then we've also got maybe a place over here where a couple nights a week I go and I have community, right? So what's the problem with that? I've still got both elements of the equation there. And if someone was to ask me, are you in community? Yeah, sure. Are you serving? Yeah, sure. I've got both elements of the equation. So what's the problem? And what God's really been working on me this week is, I think we got the wrong equation. And so I'm going to do my Vanna White and West Virginia like overhead projector thing here. Flip this over. Dun, dun, dun. Thank you. Yeah. And this is more the equation that I think God has for us. Community is a perfect place to serve. Serving with others is always an opportunity for community. And it's a constant cycle, guys. There is no breaks in there. There's no boxes. Community is a perfect place to serve. Serving with others is always an opportunity for community. Now that sounds really good, and that sounds really easy, but I'll be honest with you, I struggle to pull this off. Still, even now, I have places during the week where I go in and I'm thinking I'm going here with a servant mentality. I have other areas that I go during the week where I walk in and I think I'm going here with a community mentality. I don't think that's the way God intended for us to do this. I think what God intended is this, a cycle, intertwined, that spills into all areas of our lives. So I've been thinking about this week and praying about it this week. And what I've come up with from the brief moments in my life when I've actually pulled this off or seen this happen, or from prayer, the things that God has been showing me this week, there's two elements to this that are essential for this to happen. Jeff, would you flip that? Yeah. I'm sorry, I couldn't resist that. Very good. And the two things that are essential so that I don't put community and serving into a box, that is, I don't separate these two things in my life, is first of all, my personal relationship with God must be healthy. And second of all, I have to be intentional in my relationships with others. So what do I mean by that first one? My personal relationship with God must be healthy. Well, what I mean by that is I must be connected through God with a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. There can't be open accounts between God and I, that is unconfessed sin or anything that I've done that's caused a separation between me or God, or any type of wall, anything that I've allowed to come between me and God. I have to be fully connected with God in such a way that I can be following Him. Okay? Because what happens is, and we've all experienced this to a certain degree, when I show up with a serving mentality and I'm not right with God, I do things on my own strength. And what happens is I get tired, I get frustrated, and those are the nights that I'm just thinking, man, I just want to get to my car and go home. The other thing is I find myself running ahead of God. So I find myself doing things, spending time in areas that I think maybe God wants me to do, but I haven't really checked with Him. So I'm not following God. The other thing is things become more about what I have to do as opposed to what I get to do. And just to summarize it, guys, apart from God, I'm not a servant. And for many of you, I would imagine that you would say the same thing. Apart from God, that's just not who I am. The only way I have any chance at all of being a true servant is to be connected with God. Now, what happens when you go into community? Let's say you go into an environment and you have a community mindset. I'm going to community tonight, but you're not right with God. How does that work out? Well, what I find is typically I'm just my butt keeping a seat warm, right? Or I'm putting on a mask, pretending to be somebody that I'm not. And guys, listen to this, especially you new guys. If you're not very, very careful, you will find yourself at a time when community becomes your God. Now, what I mean by that is, if you find yourself where the conversations that you're having here are a substitute for the conversations that you should be having with God, that's a dangerous place to be. And community can actually be moving you away from God. Community is not your God. Community is not a substitute for God. Very, very, very important. So that first part, in order for me to make sure that I'm not separating community and serving, I'm not putting them in their separate little boxes, the first thing is I have to make sure my personal relationship with God must be healthy. The second thing is, and this is where I struggle, I have to be intentional in my relationships with others. I can completely show up to a serving environment, focus on the job, and not even interact with the people who are around me, right? I can show up to an environment and not take the time to actually talk to the people who are around me and say, where are you at with God? What's God doing in your life? My mom's a perfect example of this. She worked for a pastor for years. She gave her life to Christ last Thanksgiving. The reason she wasn't a Christ follower, one of the reasons was he never asked her. He never asked her where she was at with God. She served with him for years. He just never asked. I'm no different than he is. I'm not saying that in a judgmental way. I'm just as susceptible as he is. And the thing that really struck me this week, guys, and if it smacks you between the eyes like it did to me, if I'm not intentional in my relationships with others and I'm not right with God when I show up to community, I can actually believe that the task that I'm doing is more important to God than the people that are around me. I want you to stop and think about that for a minute. If I'm not right with God and I'm not being intentional in my relationships with the people that are around me, I can show up to serve God and actually believe that the task that he has me doing is more important to him than the people that are serving around me. That doesn't sound like God to me, but that's where I go. So, when I have these two areas in place, that is, my personal relationship with God is healthy, I'm being intentional in my relationships with others, what I find is the boxes start to break down. Community becomes a perfect place to serve, and serving with others is always an opportunity for community. So let me ask you guys this. When you show up for community, tonight, do you get guys' telephone numbers? When you show up for community, do you ask guys, what can I pray for you this week? Do you actually call guys and follow up with them? If you have a brother that needs help financially, physically, spiritually, when you show up to community, are you showing up to community with a serving mentality? Let me say that again. When you show up to community, are you showing up to community with a serving mentality? If you're not, you're putting them in boxes. Now, to flip that over, when you show up to serve, do you genuinely care about the people that are around you? Are you taking the time to stop with the people that you're serving with and ask them, where are you at with God? What's going on in your life?